Well, they've finally done it. The Boston Celtics are the 2024 NBA champions. It was a strange feeling when the clock ran out in Game 5, a mix of about damn time, along with the feeling that they were always going to arrive in this spot. The inevitability of these Celtics had them as the odds-on favorite from the moment this season began, and they didn't disappoint. 64-18 through the regular season, the 25th best winning percentage in NBA history, and excluding teams that didn't play 82 games, the 21st best record of all time. But they weren't just winning games, they dominated them, beating teams on average by over double-digit figures. 11.34 points to be exact, the 5th highest point differential in league history, behind only some of the greatest teams ever assembled, like the 2017 Warriors and 96 Bulls. While a cloud of doubt still hung over the Celtics due to past shortcomings, they quickly proved their regular season dominance wasn't a fluke. Of course, we have to address the elephant in the room, that being the weakened Eastern Conference they mowed their way through. The Heat were missing Jimmy Butler, the Cavs Donovan Mitchell for the last 2 games, and Tyrese Halliburton sat the last 2 of the conference finals. This is without question one of the easier finals runs we've seen in recent memory, but that being said, I don't think it matters that much. It was abundantly clear throughout the regular season that there was no one else in the East that could really stack up, and injuries or not, the Celtics still wiped the floor with each of these teams, and without Kristaps Porzingis. The only 2 games they lost were to outlier shooting performances from the Heat and Cavs, which were still relatively close games, and other than that, they handled business. So even if you ran these playoffs back without the key injuries, sure, maybe the Celtics lose a couple more games through the first 3 rounds, but it's almost certain they still come out of the East. And in the finals, where the Celtics were supposed to receive their real test, they made quick work of, albeit a favorable matchup, in the Dallas Mavericks. I'm not really going to rehash all the points that were made throughout finals coverage and go over game to game how Boston won this series, but I will give an abbreviated version, just hitting on a few key notes. The Celtics' unrivaled perimeter versatility was a nightmare for the Mavericks. On offense, they possess a true 5-out system where everyone on the court can not just shoot, but put the ball on the floor, attack closeouts, drive to the rim. The dynamism of their offense constantly had Dallas scrambling in rotation, trying to recover and close out, and the Celtics could just keep swinging the ball around until they got an open shot for any one of their 40% three-point shooters. Their defensive versatility also gave the Mavs fits, as there isn't really a weak point within their main 6-man rotation. If Derek White is your best option for targeting a defender, sounds like you don't have a ton of options. Even Al Horford, who was expected to be someone the Mavs would exploit on defense, held up great in space. And while Jaylen Brown did a great job defending Luka Doncic in isolation and taking on that primary assignment, it was actually Jason Tatum who unlocked this series for the Celtics. His ability to defend against centers meant he could guard Derek Lively and Daniel Gafford down low, essentially icing them out of the series as offensive players. Such a large part of the Mavericks' offense is Luka and Kyrie running pick-and-roll actions with ball screens from their big men, who will then use their athleticism to roll towards the rim for dump-off passes and lob opportunities. And if it's not that, the ball screen usually results in the big man's defender, who's usually another big man, getting switched onto the ball handler, aka Luka or Kyrie, who can then easily cook the lumbering big either by getting by them or creating enough space for a jump shot. This is the bread and butter of Dallas's offense and how they made it to the finals. Against the Celtics though, they could barely run any pick and roll actions because the lane was either clogged by Jason Tatum and the non-spacing big man that he was guarding, or that mismatch Luka and Kyrie typically want wasn't quite as favorable. If they got the switch, it wouldn't be some big man that gets caught on an island with them, it'd be Jason Tatum, the Celtics' best overall defender. Long story short, this forced the Mavericks to score out of isolation and settle for tough shots the whole series, and no matter how good Luka and Kyrie were gonna be, that's just a fundamentally worse formula for generating offense, so it was over from there. I'll maybe go over more of how this series went down and the Mavericks' shortcomings in a separate video on them and their future, but to quickly summarize, the Celtics supporting cast was just vastly superior to the Mavs, particularly in terms of offensive capabilities, and they couldn't make the Celtics pay for helping off of them. To anyone that was rooting for or thought the Mavs had a chance in this series, it was built on a faith that Luka Doncic and Kyrie Irving can be unreal superstar level shot makers throughout this series and will them past the Boston juggernaut. It was never about their roster as a whole. Luka and Kyrie could be the best players, but the Celtics would still have 5 of the 7 best in the series, that kind of deal. And while I think it was a bit presumptuous to assume Kyrie could or would be better than Jason Tatum and or Jaylen Brown, it doesn't really matter, cause neither him nor Luka played to their expected levels anyways. So the difference between these two rosters in terms of talent was just night and day. Anyways, that's my brief overview. I know I glossed over a lot, and if you're looking for something a bit more in-depth, as I said, I'll probably get more into the weeds about it when I talk about the Mavs, but I want to shift this over to the main point of this video. First, going over what winning this championship means for the core Celtics players, how it defines and redefines how we should look at them, and then I want to discuss the journey this Celtics team has taken to get here. Starting with Jaylen Brown, who took home Finals MVP, this one is certainly going to stand out in NBA history. That's not meant with an ounce of disrespect, it's just not the typical caliber of player you see winning Finals MVPs. But the 2024 Celtics aren't your typical championship team either, so I think it's fitting. Jaylen Brown had a hell of a series. I personally think Jason Tatum should have won Finals MVP, but Brown's consistent downhill pressure, along with taking on the Luka assignment, definitely closed the gap between him and Tatum's more big picture value. He also had the more memorable moments throughout the series, so it did feel like he put his stamp on the finals a bit more. I wrote an article about the finals MVP race before Game 4, where I contrasted the differences between Tatum and Brown's impact. If that sort of thing interests you, please go give it a read, but Brown was definitely worthy of having won it. That being said, I think the finals and this whole playoff run really does a lot for Jaylen Brown's reputation. After having a pretty bad series against the Heat in the conference finals last year, getting one of his biggest weaknesses exposed on such a big stage, the Jaylen Brown hate was at an all-time high. It didn't help that shortly after, he signed the largest contract in NBA history. It's safe to say that Jaylen Brown slander went way too far, and he was definitely being shortchanged for how great of a basketball player he is. However, and this might sound strange to say, but Brown arguably benefits the most from how talented the Celtics are because he's a much better number 2 than Jason Tatum is a 1. Obviously, the Celtics acquired this much collective talent because Jason Tatum wasn't good enough either, but he still shoulders a larger burden for this team and gets held to the highest standard. Brown gets to thrive in his position though. His shortcomings as a playmaker and ball handler are mostly hidden within his role, and thus I think it can give off the impression that he's on a level he's just not. So we shouldn't use this run and finals MVP to say Jaylen Brown is the Celtics' best player or that he himself is a top 10 player, because neither of those things are true. But it was amazing to see him ball out the way he did, especially after getting relentlessly shit on. And it's kind of poetic that Jaylen Brown got the finals MVP when the Jays finally won the chip, because he came first. I'd like to think going forward we'll have more appreciation for Jaylen Brown as one of, if not the best second option in the league. As for Jason Tatum, it's a really mixed bag on what this championship means for him. For Tatum and his fans, getting the job done is the ultimate vindicator to all criticism thrown their way over the past few years. You can argue about him not being good enough as a number 1 option, but you can't argue with a ring. Tatum and Celtics fans are definitely going to use this championship as a reason to push him into top 5 conversations when he's just not. But it also doesn't help that Tatum had a disastrous playoff run as a jump shooter. He was excellent at playmaking, defending, rebounding, arguably the Celtics' most impactful player all the way through. But it's not the sexy things he was doing well, and his shooting struggles will leave way more of an impression on the minds of viewers. I think the two things should balance out pretty well, and hopefully throughout next season and going forward, we can talk more honestly about Jason Tatum as a player who's anywhere from the 6 to 12 range. For Jrue Holiday, this is now the second time he's joined a team as one of, if not their final piece, and immediately won a championship with them. He's one of 2 players to win multiple rings in the 2020 so far, joining Kentavious Caldwell-Pope. And this should really solidify Jrue Holiday's legacy. Despite bringing home a banner in 2021, Jrue struggled offensively in the playoffs while with the Bucks and was constantly under fire for his lack of lead ball handling and shot creating abilities. In reality, he was just being tasked with too much to do in Milwaukee. We can clearly see now, when on a talented roster with enough aggregate offensive firepower to where he doesn't have to be relied upon for 20 plus a night, he can be an elite championship piece. Still one of the best defenders in the game, a fantastic decision maker, and with a roster like this, brought career high efficiency. As for Derek White, I think this championship probably means the least for him out of any of the main Celtics core. It's already well known that D. White is one of the best role players in the NBA, so if anything, it was just cool for him to be able to showcase that on a stage as large as the finals. For anyone that didn't believe those who raved about how good Derek White was all season, yeah, those people were right. He's crazy good. If he decides to leave Boston, or if they can't hold on to him, he's going to demand quite a high value on the market, upwards of $30 million a year. Kristaps Porzingis is an interesting one to examine as far as what this championship means for him and how his career will be looked at, because he had a dominant regular season in Boston as the most efficient post scorer in the league, while being statistically one of the best rim protectors as well. After a career year in Washington, it was unbelievable how the Celtics just managed to scoop him up. Porzingis has carried around the weight of being viewed as a draft bust, a bad locker room guy, and a lot of it had to do with outside factors and him not being in a position suited for him to succeed. So this is definitely someone else you could say the title is really vindicating for. But at the same time, Tink has barely played in the postseason. Fortunately for him, the little time he did play in the finals, he was fantastic and completely unstoppable. So I think more people will remember his absence from this run more so as, wow, the Celtics won it all without even having Porzingis for the most part, rather than discrediting him for riding to a championship. He's a top 25 to 30 player in the league, and if the Celtics win another title with him being more present throughout the run, it could really bump him up in all-time rankings. And as for Big Al Horford, easily one of the most deserving players in the NBA to win a championship, he finally reaches the mountaintop after 17 long seasons. It's funny to think how Al Horford will most likely be remembered for his contributions to these Celtics teams, and generations from now, people won't even know that he was that dude in Atlanta. I don't think this ring can really move Horford up the all-time rankings that much, as it comes so late in his career, but he was an undeniably positive contributor to this team, and with Porzingis down for much of the finals, things could have played out a lot differently if Horford wasn't up to the task. Considering his time with the Hawks, his all-star years, his back-to-back national championships in college, this ring is a perfect cherry on top for a Hall of Fame career as arguably the greatest Latin American NBA player of all time. And that's about it. I don't have many thoughts on how a ring changes the perception of Peyton Pritchard, Sam Hauser, or Luke Cornett. They become immortalized as part of this championship team, and if/when they move on, we'll probably be able to get a bigger bag because of it. But the one thing that's really stuck about the Celtics winning this championship is how they didn't give up. Under constant scrutiny for years, they kept banging their heads against the ceiling hoping to break through. And eventually, after compiling a starting five entirely made up of top 50 players, sure, they did. It's an excellent example of staying on course. Trying and trying again, making tweaks here or there, and just flat out getting better. At times, it was suggested Boston break up Tatum and Brown. They weren't good enough to carry the kind of load stars who take their teams to the promised land usually do, redundant skill sets, there's no alpha, they heard it all. But the front office knew what they had. The grass isn't always greener on the other side, and the Celtics were most likely much better off with the best two-way wings in the league rather than gambling and getting different star players to build around. And while their promising young co-stars continued to get better year in and year out, they properly identified their weaknesses and provided the help necessary for them to get over the hump. This 2024 Boston Celtics team is a masterclass in team building. I'm not sure if these Celtics have what it takes to win multiple championships and cement themselves as a dynasty, but they were too goddamn talented to not win it all at least once. What I do know is that this team will be back next season and just as much of a threat for the title. We'll see if they have a championship hangover and play below expectations now that they've won it, or if finally hoisting the Larry O'Brien was a breakthrough moment for this group of players as they ascend into the halls of NBA history.